My name is Chris Chaplin. I'm a missionary of the Sacred Heart. I live here in Rome. I'm on our General Council. And it's a great pleasure to be here with Dr. Roger. Let me introduce him for you. Dr. Roger Schroeder, SVD, after working in Papua New Guinea for 6 years, received a doctorate degree in missiology from the Pontifical Gregorian University in 1990. Since then, he has taught at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he is now the Louis J. Luzbetak SVD Professor of Mission and Culture and Professor of the Intercultural Studies and Ministry. He has co-authored with Stephen Bevans, Constance in Context and Prophetic Dialogue. His recent publications include Christian Tradition in Global Perspective, and with co-editor Maria Sipperman, RSCJ, Engaging Our Diversity, Interculturality and Consecrated Life Today. Roger is the International Coordinator of Anthropos Institute. And we welcome you, Roger, and we thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's very good to be here back at my alma mater, so I'll come back here to the Greg. And of course, celebrating with my colleagues as the 150th anniversary of the SVD, so it's a good occasion to be here. So today, as with the first talk focused on the interreligious, now we shift to the intercultural in this way. And when there we are. So when we talk about interculturality, I understand interculturality as a manifestation of the reign of God. We were talking about the reignocentric just now. And borrowing from the words of Gregory Boyle, Steve Evans mentioned him the other day, he talks in terms of radical kinship. What does that mean across cultures? And I'll explain that I understand culture in a postmodern sense, a much broader sense than ethnicity. So my presentation today, beginning with a few definitions, and then looking at how do different people look at interculturality in terms of the social sciences, theology, missiology, and Pope Francis. The major part of my presentation will then focus on what I've learned in terms of interculturality, what I've learned and the challenges that I've been involved in over these years. And then a few concluding remarks, making connections with the SVDs in particular. So we start, the first definition is that of culture. You may think we all understand this in the same way, but I want to make sure we're on the same page when we talk about culture. So the postmodern understanding, we talked about postmodernity yesterday, the postmodern understanding of culture is focusing on change, fluidity, unity, and diversity within cultures. It's not something static. All cultures have a legitimate way of life. And this broader understanding, or this postmodern understanding of culture, or my colleague Steve Evans refers to it as context, has different dimensions. So first of all, my understanding, or our understanding of culture, is in terms of social location. Rich and poor experience culture in very different ways. Male and female, men and women in very different ways. Rural and urban, young and old. And when I began this work in interculturality some years ago, my Latin American colleague said, Roger, if you're talking about interculturality, you must talk about power dynamics. You must talk about the power dynamics in any exchange in that way. So you can see that I'm looking at culture in a much broader sense. Culture also in terms of social change, ongoing and fluid. When I first went to Papua New Guinea back in 1975, I was still under the modern understanding of culture, thinking that the village had one culture. But I realized men and women, different people had different understandings. And I also realized that the cultures in those villages in New Guinea also were changing. They weren't just static. It's going on. Ethnicity and race is a part of culture. And within a single group, Individual and communal situations also differ. So when you move from one place to another, in Chicago, if I move from one African-American Catholic parish to another, there's a different context. We can't say all black Catholic parishes are the same. So culture is not only ethnicity. I put that in bold because I run into this all the time. When I talk about culture, they focus it's only ethnicity. But culture is much bigger than that, as we understand in the postmodern way. 3 words that I often use in the classroom in talking about every culture. Every culture must provide meaning, identity, and order. Moving to the theological perspective, every culture has both grace and sin. I have this parable I use about entering the garden of the other, where there are both the good seeds of the Word of God and the weeds that are there in that way. And the danger of ethnocentrism is in every culture. And I'll define ethnocentrism in a moment. Another common image used about culture is that of the iceberg. 15% of the iceberg is above the water level, which you can see. How people dress, what they eat, what language they speak. 85% of a culture is below the water level. That's the world view. When we go to another culture, we start by understanding what's above the water level, but then hopefully we can begin to understand what's the world view that's underlying that. The second term I will define is that of interculturality itself. To do that, I distinguish different terms to understand it in contradistinction to them. Monocultural living is homogeneous and ethnocentric tendency is very strong. I grew up in a county in Ohio in U.S. that was 95% German American Catholic farmers. So quite monocultural, but still there was diversity, but limited in that way. As Catherine was saying, nowadays, where do you find such pure, just one culture? I like it. The second term is that of international and multicultural living. This is the mere presence of other culture in the same space. I fly out of O'Hare Airport in Chicago. It is multicultural. There are different nationalities there, but we don't necessarily talk to each other. The goal is basically tolerance. How can we tolerate one another and stand in the right lines to get on the plane? Yeah. Cross-cultural is moving from one direction to another. So for example, I went to New Guinea in '75. I crossed into the other culture. My first job is to learn what's above the water level, the language, malaria, food, things like that. So that's going in one direction. It's a good thing, and many of us have experienced that, moving in one direction. Intercultural is pushing the boundary, where there's mutually enriching and challenging relationships in both directions with people who are different. This is moving in a new way. Okay. In our last talk, we were talking about that, the mutual enrichment between religions. Now I'm talking about mutual enrichment between cultures. Ethnocentrism is when we use our own culture, and again, culture in a broad sense, as a normative lens for seeing, interpreting, and judging others. So it's important. Culture plays a role of giving us meaning, identity, and order, but at the same time, if we use it to judge others. The 2 images I have here, the one on the upper right, is that sort of with the culture that we were born with. But when we look at others, we are to look at others through God's eyeglasses, just to use an example, where all peoples are God's children. Intercultural living, intentional, has to be intentional engagement of difference for the sake of understanding and enrichment. It requires tolerance for ambiguity, walking into outside of our comfort space. Commitment to mutual dialogue, and if the other party is not open to dialogue, that's monologue. So dialogue implies that both are open. Openness to change and challenge, aim to create a balanced relationship, acknowledging our prejudices. We all have them, all of us. The goal here is interculturality, is a manifestation of that reign of God. The image here on the right is a book that was co-edited by Stanislaus, one of our organizers here, an SVD publication. As a religious value, the meaning of interculturality goes beyond mere coexistence, beyond just tolerance. Quote, to emphasize and make more explicit the essential mutuality of the process of cultural interaction on both a personal and social level. This is coming from Bob Casala, a colleague that is president of Nansan University in Japan. Why? For the sake of the Missio Dei that we're talking about. This is both within the church, ad intra, and in ministry itself. So within the church, engaging the difference, and outside. Now I turn to the social sciences. I myself have a foot in the social sciences as well as in theology and missiology. I did a lot of that work in anthropology when I was in Papua New Guinea. So there's three different areas that the social scientists talk about interculturality. They were talking about it before we were talking about it explicitly, at least in the church. The three different areas, the first is moving from ethnocentrism to interculturality, and there are various stages. One of them is Milton Bennett. On the right is sort of an image that he has 6 stages, moving from denial of other cultures to integration. He provides a tool. I've used this tool with different persons, congregational leadership and that, to see where do we stand, huh? Sometimes we think we're better than we are when you take this, huh? So again, give us a sense of where are we in terms of ethnocentrism, and he calls it ethno-relativism. I avoid that word relativism, but I would call it interculturality. The second area is in terms of moving from colonialism to decoloniality. Milanio talks about differences are not cast in terms of values of plus and minus degrees of humanity. Colonialism, decoloniality. In the face of that, what do the social sciences say? How can we rebuild that relationships? My students in Chicago, I have many students from countries that have been colonized. Decoloniality is a conversation we have in a classroom a lot. We talk about this a lot. Huh? Yeah. So, and then also S.M. Michael, who is, he was up here, one of the moderators yesterday, one of my colleagues. He says we need to move beyond the colonial understanding of Christian mission, because colonialism and mission was very much tied together. Now, how do we move beyond that colonial understanding of mission? The third area is from globalization to mutual respect and power among cultures. Globalization is a huge topic. I'm not going to try to delve into that now. But again, when you look at that sort of that, what they call world culture, although I don't like using the word culture in that sense, but anyways, what happens to the local situations and peoples in that way? So the social sciences highlight the potential of true interculturality for contributing to the creation of a world in which individuals, communities, and nations interact in a more appropriate and mutually enriching fashion. So I draw a lot from the social sciences when I began this work back in 2010 to look at that. Also then we turn to theology and missiology. Vatican II, the shift from, quote, an old heroic paternalistic model of mission, I'm talking generally speaking, not every missionary, reaching down to save and help another person, to a model of humility and mutuality. Developing a reciprocal relationship out of respect to how God is already present in the other. Also in Vatican II, a positive assessment of culture. Again, every culture has both seeds of the word and elements contrary to the reign of God, theologically speaking. And true intercultural interaction is crucial for mutual enrichment and for the recognition of a continual call to conversion for all. All of us are called to that conversion on the cultural side. No culture is a Christian culture. Every culture has elements that need to be converted, in that way. Also, the shift in terms of missiology and interculturality, the shift in mission before Vatican II, from the West to the rest, from Europe, North America, and Australia out to the rest of the world. Now we talk about mission on all 6 continents. Again, strong in terms of the understanding of intercultural mutuality between local churches and peoples. Church is missionary by nature. Every local church is mission sending and mission receiving. I went to Papua New Guinea as a missionary, and now there's a Papua New Guinean SVD brother working in Chicago. So we, together. I actually met him, anyways, that's a long story. I met him in New Guinea in '87. We went fishing together. Yeah. Also the shift from ad gentes to inter gentes. And we talked about this a bit the other day, rather than just one directional to the nations, among the nations. And this is something that Tony Pernia, who will be speaking after me today, he's one, and other than Jonathan Tan and others are talking about. Again, the sense of mutuality. What I see is the complementarity of the social sciences and missiological theological perspectives. I see the two coming together very well. It's not like everything the social sciences are doing, I say, yes, that's good for our use. No. But how do we learn from each other? Interdisciplinary fashion. And it both require conversion from our prejudices from all us, them categories. Then to Pope Francis, interculturality, his own postmodern understanding of culture. He talks about in Evangelii Gaudium, popular piety, scientific academic circles, ecology, state and society. This is all I would understand within the postmodern understanding of culture in a broad sense. In Fratelli Tutti, in the section on fraternity and social friendship, chapter 4, quoting, we need to regard our differences as an opportunity to grow in mutual trust and to hand on the values of their own culture and welcome the good that comes from the other's experience, mutuality. We need to recognize the features of our own cultures, its richness, its possibilities, and its limitations. So that's a sense of vulnerability. Again, we acknowledge our richness, but then are we open? Then the whole synodal process, becoming a synodal church of listening and speaking, an inclusive church of sisters and brothers in Christ. Interculturality is at the heart of the pilgrimage of creating a more synodal church. I really see the connection between interculturality and the synodal process. So now to the main section I was talking about here is the learnings and challenges in terms of interculturality. So the what? The what is the complexity of postmodern culture. Things I've already mentioned before. Social location, change, ethnicity, individual experiences. And then we also talk about intersectionality, where people have carried different identities, A woman in a favela in Brazil, the different coming together. My own work in anti-racism now, working together in the U.S. for these 3 years with different groups of people. Intersectionality, different aspects that we affect. Again, the iceberg, the under the water level is a big challenge to understand. Again, I talk about power dynamics. Edric Lau, the name sounds British, but he's actually Chinese American, and he does a lot to talk about mutuality. I use some of his methodology in the classroom, how to develop circles of learners, like synodality in the classroom. And interculturality has many us-them categories. And I know for some you may say you're spreading out the word of culture too broadly, but the work I find in interculturality, I've identified 15 different us-them categories that people have to overcome. And I list some of them here. Race, gender, generations, gender, migration, ableism, poverty, sexual orientation, clericalism, ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, divorce, Catholics, theology, politics. You can go on. But these are the conversations that people want to engage me with when I talk about this. The who. The who applying to all peoples, and from Jesus, the Good Samaritan parable, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Very powerful. The encounter of Jesus with the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman, in which she helped Jesus, I think, you may not agree with that word, but helped Jesus to overcome his own ethnocentrism. He helped to see how God was working in new ways. She was the one that opened up his world, and he recognized, he said, your faith is strong. He saw that in her. Samaritan woman at the well, Jesus overcoming various us-them categories, and table fellowship, who's invited to the table. I give whole talks on this, so you're getting just a glimpse, Yeah. The early church and interculturality as we work our way through Acts of the Apostles. And you see how that early disciples of Jesus, how those men and women needed to encounter how the Word of God took them outside of their own social categories. To the Samaritans, Ethiopian eunuch, to Cornelius, to Antioch, and as you move on. I do a lot of work with religious congregations of women and men. In terms of religious life, the current areas that I often work with in terms of interculturality, formation, spirituality, leadership, finances, community life. And then ad extra in our ministry, what does that mean? Engaging the other, another. I work a lot with the International Union of Spirit Generals. Pat is here, the USG. We do a lot of work with internationally. Parishes, dioceses, bishops' conferences. The who is it applies to all of us. Yeah? The how. So my former colleague, Tony Gittins, who died several years ago, did a lot of work in interculturality. The book that's here is a book I can use internationally, also is translated into Spanish. He has this chart. A, B, C, D is representing different cultures. How do they become mutually enriched and challenged between each other? And then for the sake of the E, the common purpose. That common E in a parish, multicultural parish, what's that common E that people live for the life of the parish, huh? In diocese, what does that mean? I was in San Diego for 4 days, San Diego Diocese, talking about what does that mean for the diocese? Bishops' conferences, religious congregations, faith-based institutions. Now for missionaries and or cross-cultural ministers, that E also includes being in a mutual relationship and solidarity with the particular local church. And this is something that often gets overlooked. So how do they embrace, engage themselves in a local context? The history of a local church, a community that they're in. So it's not just in a religious community, but where you're at, where you're living in that way. Huh? This is very important. Again, this gets overlooked many times. Huh? I'm speaking from my own experience of working with congregations and peoples. Huh? Also, if a cultural group only focuses on reinforcing their own culture, this can be tending towards ethnocentrism or relativism and not truly interculturality. And again, this is something I see happening. People say, oh, interculturalities. Now I can lift up my own culture. Yes. And don't forget to connect with the others. These are dangers I see. And again, how people understand and practice interculturality. Now the how this is something I use in my classroom all the time. I talk about the head, the heart, and the hands. So we start with the head. So understanding others from their perspectives. Listening to stories, people have talked about that, the importance of this. The role of an insider and outsider mentors. When I went to New Guinea, I had insider mentors. Benjamin Wakwanje was a Papua New Guinea man who helped me to learn to live in the village, but I also had missionaries who had lived there who also helped me to understand that. Huh? Insider, outsider mentors. This is very, very important. Huh? Study of history and culture. What does that mean too? So this is the head. How do we do that? Yesterday we talked about postmodern society. Huh? So how do we understand that? We need to understand the head. Yeah? There are sociological tools and frameworks, many different tools that I found are very helpful in the work that many of us are doing, looking at social-centric, individual-centric societies, social-centric well-being of the group of primary importance, individual-centric well-being of the individual. Huh? This is a practice that I use with many communities, and I find it very helpful. For example, I know you can't read probably the names there. It says West and East, which I wish they used other terms, but if the West is more the individual, I'm not saying individualistic, I'm saying individual-centric, well-being of the individual. So for example, in the West, equality is seen as a very high value, but this can seem disrespectful for those in social-centric societies. So in Chicago, I live, there's a priest from Ghana who I live with, and we have to determine how we're going to call each other. So I said, can I call you Frank? He said, you can call me Frank. He's a priest. And I said, and you can call me Father Roger. Huh? So we negotiate. Because in different cultures, how you understand authority and roles and hierarchical understandings. So that's where we compromise. Is it okay? I'll call you Frank. You call me Father Roger. Okay. Okay. Again, these are some of the practical things. In some ways it's simple, but sometimes we overlook these things. Huh? Yeah. Conflict style, and there's 4 different basic patterns of how cultures deal with conflict. That's an exercise that I often use to help understand that. Intercultural competency guides, social analysis, Maria Simperman, a colleague of mine, she's developed a book on that, and there's a lot of work in that area. Let's move to the heart. So the heart, the conversion and transformation of all. So how do we move in that direction? So all prejudices, how do we name those? In the Acts of the Apostles, we have the conversion of Peter in encounter with Cornelius. I know we talk about the conversion of Cornelius, but also Peter went through a conversion against his own ethnocentrism, how he understood, that God's grace was extended to all peoples. Yeah. Oh God, I didn't know you were so big. This comes from Sojourner Truth. She was a freed slave woman, and she talked about, oh God, I didn't know you were so big. In other words, how great God is. Our own experience, yes, but God is much greater. Yeah. Here I have an image of the apology of Pope Francis of the First Nation peoples of Canada in 2022, conversion of heart. And there he's speaking on behalf of the church. I do a lot of work also with indigenous peoples in the United States for many years, over 30 years. So striving for full reconciliation. This is, of course, a big challenge. And then to the hands. How do we do this? How do we move in that way? Anthony Gittins talks in terms of intentional, faith-based. Goodwill is not enough. Goodwill is good, but we still make mistakes. Requires hard work, learning from mistakes, diplomacy, compromise, mutual respect, dialogue. When I say compromise, I don't mean compromising our basic human values or Christian values, but compromise. I call you Frank, you can call me Father Roger. That's a small compromise. Sometimes the compromises are bigger. And a common and sustained vision of the E. What are we about? Religious congregations, what's that E? It's our mission statements, it's our constitutions, it's our vow of life. How do we do that together? But we do it a little differently. One of the studies I'm involved in now is how does culture impact our 3 vows? What is that? How do we understand them? Another exercise that I have used is called mapping, bridging, integrating, the MBI. I mentioned the names of the people who developed this. Mapping. This is a process that can be done. My colleague Phil Gibbs, who's sitting in the front row here, he used this in Papua New Guinea in a practical way. Mapping. What are the relevant differences? Bridging. How do we then send and receive, bridge between our differences? Then integrating. How do we integrate those differences and build upon them? It's a simple process, but it's a process that may take time. But how do we again address our differences? Naming, bridging, integrating. When I work with religious communities, normally I work with a team of people who are committed to 3 years that can begin to be sort of a source of change within their own congregation. So having a team that you can work with, and then finding a critical mass of members to support those efforts. A critical mass doesn't mean majority, but you need enough people to make change. Yeah. In a good way. I'm not talking about forcing, but again, how do we move ahead? The why, interculturality is a paradigm of mission, highlights the inspiring and challenging opportunities for contributing to a fuller, but not complete, realization of God's reign around the banquet table in our world and in all creation today. This is an image here. You see people in wheelchairs and everybody coming together. So in my concluding remarks, are a little longer, 5 minutes, I should be fine. Okay, good. So this is where I bring in the SVDs and that. So interculturality and the Arnottis family. When I say the Arnottis family, there are 3 congregations. There's the SVDs, active missionaries, the SSPS sisters, active women missionaries, and then our Pink sisters, our Adoration sisters. So the 3 congregations. In the founding generation, Wilhelm Schmidt, an anthropologist, back at that time in the 19th century, was one of the early members of the SVDs. Arnold Janssen as the leader who supported Arnold Janssen's commitment to learning languages and cultures of different peoples, and Joseph Ferdinand who practiced it in China. It went from a moment of having little respect for the Chinese culture to, at the end of his life, I want to die a Chinese. Huh? So again, 3 different ways. Teresa Mesner I bring in as SSPS. She was the first Superior General of the SSPS. She was Superior General during World War I. And she is a very prophetic figure, talked about, the women in the congregations whose nations were at war with each other. How do they live together in a respectful way? Yeah. So a very concrete, She was very prophetic figure. The anthropologist tradition is that which Wilhelm Schmidt as an anthropologist began to develop, and it was supported. He began a journal in 1906, which continues to be edited and published. He established an Anthropos Institute in 1931 to support those efforts of understanding religion and cultures of other people. This organization was restructured as Anthropos Institute International to move away from a more centered on a European center to polycentric, a global understanding, in that way. This was very much impacted by Tony Pernia, who will be speaking after me today when he was congregational leader of the SVDs. And in this, we both have academic rigor and what does it mean for mission today. Currently, at this time, as of January, there are 44 individual members, SVD mostly, but also SSBS, and we have a couple of Hindu anthropologists also, so around the world, and we have 10 centers that focus on the study of culture in their own context. So sort of in a broad way. In 2008, the SSBS sisters had a general chapter in Interculturality. 2012, the SVDs. At that time, a month after the general chapter in 2012, a group of us were in Canada, and some of us are in the room here right now. Michael's here. And we came together and said we'd be a resource for society to make a link between the anthropos tradition of anthropology, social sciences, and the role of mission today. So we came forward and volunteered to our general chapter, our superiors, saying we're willing to be a resource committee, and they said, thank you very much. So we then became a committee in 2015. In 2019, it was reconfigured so we have an equal number of SSBS sisters and SVDs. And there's 2 co-chairs, myself and Adriana Momanda of Argentina. We do international programs for intercultural resource persons, formators, leadership. I work with a lot of other religious congregations, dioceses, and also we do a lot of work between interculturality and spirituality. To me, I really see, it's become very clear to me the very importance, and luckily our congregations see that link, how important that is, between our spirituality work and our interculturality, as center to our charism of our religious community. So now, concluding remarks. So again, interculturality as a manifestation of the reign of God. Gregory Boyle's term, a radical kinship. There are challenges for sure. I know about that, and there's also many opportunities. I've shared with you some of the learnings that I've had, and I've had to work hard to try to keep it in this time frame, but there's a lot that we're all learning, not just me. So just to end with Pope Francis, I won't declare him as saint yet, so anyways, we'll keep him as Pope Francis at the moment. If the conviction of all human beings, our brothers and sisters, is not to remain an abstract idea, but to find concrete embodiment, then numerous related issues emerge, forcing us to see things in a new light and to develop new responses. Okay, thank you.
Father Roger, thank you true, I think is the right word, yeah? Thank you true. We give thanks for taking us into the garden and showing us around and helping us to see some of the beauty of interculturality and what it offers us. And particularly the words that kept standing out for me are mutuality and synodality. Yeah. So thank you for what you shared with us. Let's put our hands together in thanks for Roger's presentation. We now have an opportunity for 3 questions. We saw what happened last time when we had 4 questions. We didn't give enough time to our speaker to speak. Can we keep the questions to questions, please, rather than long introductions? Just what's your question? The first 3 hands, please. This man here, so we'll just get the 3 questions first. The second question down the front here, okay? And yourself? 3rd question. So that we have 3 questions. Let's hear the first one. Thank you.
Pavel Bargar, Prague. Thank you very much, Roger. My question is, how would you connect your talk on cultures with what we heard earlier on religions, connection between religion and culture?
Thank you very much. And down here? All Irishmen.
Can you say something about the growth of the right-wing groups, especially in Europe and culture? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I was just struck by the us-them categories, and I don't think they necessarily need to be held in tribal ways. And I just wanted to ask about the relationship between identity and in interculturality, because it seems to me that you can't. It's not. There is a tension. One shouldn't see those us-them categories necessarily as adversarial or conflictive, but how do you affirm identity and at the same time maintain openness in this whole intercultural endeavor? How do you promote belonging without othering?
Okay, thank you for those 3 very succinct questions. You have 12 minutes, Father Roger.
Break first. Okay, you hear me now? Okay, so Pavel, thank you. Certainly there's a link between culture and religion. And I think, sometimes you can't just sort of split things in that way. Because when you're looking you often have those both identities that are there. And I think, building upon what we heard earlier today, that importance of the interreligious dialogue and interculturality, I think that they can go, they can relate to each other. Now, again, I know there are different dynamics too, because there's different histories and different things connected with identity, but I think that we can do that. Certainly in New Guinea, I know religion and culture you can't separate. With indigenous peoples, religion and culture, that's a Western division between religion and culture. I learned that when I first went. I went with the categories, and I tried to label, this is religious, this is culture, and it's like, forget it, You can't talk about that. So I think, sometimes the connection is very clear. Other times, yeah. So I think it's, and both of them, I think, have a similar attitude of openness, but at the same time, keeping our own identity. Good, thank you, Pavel. Yeah, in terms of the right wing, so in the classroom in Chicago, I've been teaching there 34 years, and when I first started there, diversity had to do with men and women, you count women students in one hand. Now it's very different, or religious and lay, and then there's generations, then there's cultures, then there's nationalities. Then about 12 years ago, that area of diversity was more theological diversity, an understanding of the church in that way, and that, of course, gets linked to politics well. So what I try to do in the classroom is encourage people to find ways of dialogue. And it can be very challenging, very, very challenging, I know. And often it's monologue, and so you can't go very far. But in the classroom, I say, when you're going out into the world, you need to try to find a way to engage the other. Or sometimes I say another, who's the other, but another in that way. So I think it is very challenging, but I think I try to promote the same sort of principles. How do you try to understand the world of another from their perspective? Why do they hold that stance? What is that about? in the United States, a real polarity between in the Catholic Church, huh? And it comes to the classroom now too, of course, huh? So how do you engage that, understanding where people are coming from? Yeah, okay. It's a big question. Good. Yeah, I think that in terms of the us-them categories, I don't like those terms. It's polarity, and I want to avoid that. Huh? I'm just sort of using the categories that are out there. So God does not see us-them, but we, sees it in that way. So I think that, I think you got your fingers on the point. Is how do we both maintain our own identity and open to others as well? How do we do that balance in that regards? Yeah? And I think that's a big challenge. I mean, it's the same thing we heard about today in terms of interreligious dialogue. How do we be open to the rays of truth in the other religion and maintain our own faith in that way? So I think culturally it also applies in that way. And this is a question that students often ask me, how do we do that? How can we gauge the other and at the same time be open to how they are children of God too, and God's presence with them, and to really learn and appreciate from them. I mean, I can't think of a quick example, but I've had many examples in my life of trying to do that. Trying to understand what does that mean, huh? And to appreciate the other. Doesn't mean I don't become the other, no, but how to appreciate it, and then at the same time maintain my own identity. It's a both and, I think. I want to get rid of the duality, huh? What's the both and in that regards? Yeah, good. So maybe we have time for...
Yes, you still have time. You still have time for another question. Might even... You're very succinct, by the way.
I'm a teacher.
I'm Yulis, I'm an SVD. As I am aware, and also you mentioned about you are doing a study in the relationship between interculturality and vows, religious vows. Yeah. I know it's in ongoing work, but can you just give us some clue about maybe some of your findings, whether we will change our understanding and way we are living our three vows, or you still... Just for the sake of curiosity.
Yeah, you have to.
Thank you.
You have to keep your vows. You're not just. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, we can do it. We can do it too. Okay, I'll get to it. Did he have?
Yeah. I have a question, Schroeder. When Christianity enters into some cultures, certainly that culture undergoes certain changes. But also it can give rise to cultural conflicts.
Sure.
It simply means that there is an attempt for that culture, receiving culture, to retain its originality vis-a-vis the new culture that emerges with the encounter of Christianity. We do find some of these conflicts taking serious turns. Such moments, maybe we can begin to ask, what has Christianity contributed to a culture to which it has entered? Has it, done something good, or has it, caused some harm to that culture? I think this is a serious question arising in many of the Asian contexts. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I think we'll stay to those two questions now. So the first question in terms of culture and the vows, this is we've done a questionnaire with a lot of both the sister SVD and SSPS, and we're continuing to process together with the spirituality team and the interculturality team. And it's interesting to see, for example, with the vows, to see how the vows are understood and lived. People are living the vows faithfully, but their culture has an impact of how they understand it and practice it. So the importance of family. In certain cultures, I won't name the particular culture now, but there's one culture that is so strong on the importance of family in religious life. So decisions are made. Do I stay in their community or do I go home to help with the finances there? Huh? And this is something that's very strong of how they understand. The vow of obedience, it's quite clear, muddy clear, but clear that, you know, in certain cultures, those of social-centric societies where it's important to maintain harmony, and therefore when an elder or a leader speaks, you do it. You follow along. The importance of that. Other cultures are much more, oh no, we're going to talk about this. We have to discuss this in religious life. So in religious life, that we have people in the same community that have different de facto understandings of authority. So now there's also personality issues, not issues, but personality and culture. There's other things involved, and that your family background and that. However, that becomes helpful to begin to understand why are there differences of people, how do they understand the vow of obedience? They're both following it, but one says we need to talk more about this more on an individual basis. Others say, whatever you say, but I'm more clear about I will follow what you say. Yeah? So we're still working at this, huh? Yeah, so we can talk later. The other question, we're the same community. There's much more to say, huh? And it's very interesting. I mean, this is not out of just theoretical understanding. This is impacting our life. Yeah? Okay. The other question, I think, again, it's a very complex question, how much, if I understood correctly, how Christianity affects change in cultures can be good or bad, and how do you sort that out? And that's a big question. So if I can give you a concrete example, which is not India, but Papua New Guinea. So when I was in Papua New Guinea, what was happening there, they had the male initiation rituals, and they had female initiation also, but as a man, I could not enter that world. But the men's was, 8 stages over 40 years, from childhood to elderhood, huh? And this was happening all over that whole area of Papua New Guinea when I was there. Now, I arrived a month after independence. So they're dealing not just with political change, social change, and that. Huh? So then part of it was Christianity as well. So I was fortunate to be able to accompany them as they discuss things like our traditional initiation. What things are there that we need to keep, which are good, in line with the reign of God? And what are those things that are contrary to the reign of God? Yeah? So they had to go through their own discernment process. There were some things of traditional nation, some of the young people would die because of the physical, things that happened. But there's also many good things. So they had to discern that. Huh? And then in that same process, we got into conversations with them taking the lead. Now, so one was, how do we do traditional initiation as Christians? And then, how do we do Christian initiation as Papua New Guineans? So what are the values that we have that can enrich how we do, we call it enculturation today. But that takes time. And luckily there was a sister there from Australia that I worked with who did study a female initiation. So she accompanied the women catechists, the women leaders to go through the same sort of a discernment process. Huh? But the process is what's important. At the end, okay, you have this confirmation and enculturation, but the process of that discerning. But I know it's a complex situation. And then, of course, in India, you got the political, a different context going on. Okay?
Sorry, but we've run out of time. You might have another question, and perhaps you could address your questions during the break to Roger. But for the sake of the group, we've run out of time. Roger, we'd like to thank you and congratulations on 150 years to you and the SVDs. Thank you for your presentation. We all now have a break for 20